Good evening, friends. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first Politics a Pint of the 2019-2020 school year. Woo! You can clap for that. Before we get started, I'm going to allow Owen Ferguson to give you a quick update about fundraising efforts for Hurricane Dorian relief.
Thank you, Quinlan. Good evening, everyone. My name is Owen Ferguson. I'm a senior economics major from Nassau, Bahamas, and this evening I'm coming to you as one of the co-chairs of the Archipelago Caribbean Association. So as most, if not all of you are aware, recently Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas, most negatively impacting two of our most heavily populated islands, Abaco and Grand Bahama, leaving 50 citizens dead, and at least 50 citizens dead, and over 2,000 citizens displaced. And yeah, it's definitely the most tragic natural disaster we have faced up to date. There have been several international support efforts, including those here on campus, facilitated by the Archipelago Caribbean Association with the help of IASS and the support of groups such as the McCarthy Center, Campus Ministry, and a variety of other campus partners. So I guess I'll just make you aware of ways that you could support and get involved. Right now there is a way to donate financially through globalgiving.com. And the name of the channel is St. Ben's and St. John's, supporting our friends in the Bahamas. It's under the name of Castasia Thompson, who is co-chair along with me on the St. Ben's side. And right now we're just a little under $45,000, which is so incredible. We have had gifts anywhere from $2 to four-figure gifts, which is tremendous. We are incredibly grateful for the support we have gotten thus far, but definitely not going to get complacent. As I mentioned, there are so many people who have been negatively impacted, and all of us Bahamian students here on campus know or are connected to someone who has been displaced in some sort. And so we really are pushing for ways to relieve them in some sort. If you are curious about where these resources are going, once we do close the fundraiser financially, the resources will be going to the consulate office in Washington, D.C. From there, they will be going to NEMA, which is the Natural Disaster Agency in the Bahamas, which will be allocating the resources to those who are in need the most. So they will get the resources on a need-based merit. And if you aren't able to donate financially, any sort of household items can be dropped off at IISS, and you could just indicate that it is for the Hurricane Dorian relief. So whether that be sheets, toiletries, any sort of batteries, something that could go toward food preparation, it's greatly appreciated. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me. If you have supported already, it's greatly appreciated. And if it's something you're considering to do, I really would encourage you. It would be astoundingly appreciated. So thanks for this opportunity, and hope you enjoy the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Owen. Just to give y'all a little look at what the event's going to look like tonight, we're going to try and get wrapped up in under 60 minutes. We're going to take about 35 minutes for our panel discussion, and then we're going to take 15 minutes at the very end for questions from the audience, from you all. We are so fortunate to have four fantastic panelists with us tonight. We're going to start with young Cardinal. He's going to tell you a little bit about Active Minds, the organization that the McCarthy Center is partnering with for this event. And then we'll get right to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Yep. So hello, everyone. My name is Young Cardinal. I'm a St. John's senior and psychology major, and I'm representing Active Minds tonight. If you all saw the poster outside, our goal is to change the conversation on mental health and break down the stigma that is alive and well today. As you can all see, I'm wearing a ribbon, which is for mental health awareness. It's at every table, so feel free to put one on. And we have buttons and stickers spread out throughout the pub with popular sayings from active minds. Feel free to take some or to talk to our executive members in the back, Claire, Delaney, and Ashley. Just to change the conversation, this talk definitely will help with that tonight, and I'm very appreciative of the McCarthy Center to co-sponsor the event with us and to have me on the panel with 3 other wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. All right, I'll introduce myself. My name is Mike Ewing. I'm the Director of Counseling and Health at St. Ben's at St. John's. And it's in that role that Quinlan reached out to me to ask me to join this panel. As just part of a way of introducing that, one of the things I like to do is make sure people know that counseling exists on campus. And hopefully you do. There's a couple of things I would want you to know about it. Counseling is available as one of the many resources to help students be successful during college at no additional charge. Right? So counseling at St. Ben's and St. John's, like many colleges across the country, is offered at no charge, in part to reduce the barriers that people might experience when reaching out for mental health support, mental health treatment, mental health resources. And so St. Ben's and St. John's many decades ago designed this service as something students can use without that additional reaching into your pocket, looking for your insurance card, those kinds of things, right? It's also confidential. I think that's an important piece that can be another barrier for people deciding whether or not they want to seek help. Our record system is an internal electronic health record that is exclusive to us. It's not part of any other record systems on campus. So when someone seeks counseling, it is not part of their being a student's record. It's not part of their residential life record. It's not part of the registrar's office records. It's strictly us, and students are in control of who can receive any information from the person with whom they meet. And I don't want to go into long, boring detail about some of those things. But no additional charge and confidential, I think, are 2 central components. We are located in the ground floor, or garden level, as I like to call it, of both Mary Hall at St. John's and Lottie Hall at St. Ben's. Probably more familiar to you as Mary Basement and Lottie Basement. We just don't like to think we're working in the basement. Right? So that would be maybe a bit of my introduction. Amanda and I are the co-advisors for Active Minds.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Jantzer. I am an assistant professor in the psychology department. I'm a counseling psychologist, co-advisor of Active Minds. I'm also the co-administrator of the Becoming Community Grant. And I will put a plug in that the psychology department is newly united, and we have a lovely new home in 3rd floor Main. So come by and see us if you haven't been there.
Good evening. My name is Shane Miller. I'm a professor in the communication department, and I teach courses and do research in the area of public discourse and the impact it has on public communities. Something else that I suppose would be relevant for the conversation tonight is I am also an avid hunter. I've handled firearms since I was a young kid, shooting ranges, skeet shooting, target shooting, etc. So bring that practical background to the conversation as well.
I think I have been nominated. Okay, so as a faculty member in the psychology department, I thought I should do what psychologists do, which is go and see what the literature says about this issue. And so I began to read a lot of difficult things. And so what I found is that the kind of rhetoric, the public rhetoric that I think spurred this conversation today is not new. It's very high profile, but it's not new. In fact, there's an article by Metzel and McLeish in 2015 who really gave a lot of compelling examples of the ways in which rhetoric about mental illness very commonly comes into the public sphere after mass shootings. You hear things about undiagnosed schizophrenia, about people being delusional. You hear public pundits say things like, guns don't kill people, the mentally ill do. And what some suggest is that there's a kind of a circular logic here, that people see this horrifying thing happen, and many people think, Only a crazy person would do this thing. Therefore, the person who did this thing must be mentally ill. And so it funnels and fuddles this stereotype. But we also hear other things in the public sphere. We hear people calling for national registries. We hear people calling for mandated reporting of so-called dangerous patients, and so on and so forth. So we know some things based on the data. We know that these do not reflect reality. I will read to you a statement from one of our main psychological organizations. The president of the American Psychological Association released a statement, and actually so did the CEO. I'll read the CEO. I saw this on your list too. So the CEO said, "We as psychological scientists have said repeatedly, the overwhelming majority of people with mental illness are not violent. The overwhelming majority of people with mental illness are not violent. There is no single personality profile that can reliably predict who will resort to gun violence. Based on the research, we only know that a history of violence is the single best predictor of who will commit future violence." That's the best we have, past history. And so the statistics also tell us other things. The statistic tells us that this rhetoric paints a really, really big, broad stereotype about a very diverse population of people. Some of the statistics, this again goes back to 2015, but some of the statistics show that people with mental illness are actually involved with crime, including crime that involves guns, at a much lower rate than the national average. And we also know that the most common psychological diagnoses, things like depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, ADHD, have no correlation with violence whatsoever. So this is a big, broad brush we're using when we're talking about people with mental illness. There's other interesting research that suggests it's not just this rhetoric that creates stigma against people with mental illness, but it's simply mass media stories about gun violence. There was an interesting study that came out in 2013 by McGittney, Webster, and Berry that suggested that people just reading about stories about mass shootings would have higher associations of stigma against people with mental illness. They reported less willingness to work with people with mental illness, a higher perceived dangerousness of people. So it's not just the rhetoric that this heightened attention. I'll turn this over, but there's one last thing I'd like to provide here for context. And it's that history is really, really important. I teach psychology classes. I teach about the history of abnormal psychology. And what we know about this history is that the history of how we collectively in the United States have treated people with mental illness is a terrible, dark, dark history, where people have over time been locked up, literally chained, put in storehouses. Over history, we've tortured people with lobotomies and cold water baths. It is a dark, dark history. Up until the 1970s in the United States, there were many states on the books who had sterilization laws coming out of the eugenics movements, that people with mental illness could be sterilized and were against their will. So when we start to talk about national registries or locking people up with mental illness, that is a chilling kind of rhetoric for me that I think we should all pay attention to.
I'm going to say thank you, Amanda, for going first, right? So much of what I'm going to say dovetails well with what Amanda's already said, so I'll try to keep that part shorter. But the biggest piece that I was going to leave with is this one that she did as well. Taking this approach, believing that mental illness is the underlying root cause of gun violence, takes us backwards, not forwards, to what Amanda described, so I won't re-describe it. It's a move towards more stigma. So I'm sitting here, this is my 22nd year at St. John's and St. Ben's, and the stigma in my career from here and the other two institutions I worked at prior to coming to here, mental health has gone steadily down. Now it's not gone. I doubt that'll happen by the end of my career or Cardinal's career, but it's going the right direction. People are being treated with dignity and respect who have mental illness histories. And the idea that mentally ill people are people we should be afraid of is a move backwards. It's a move towards, again, what Amanda already said, so I won't say the same things. But it also, so that's one piece. Another piece Amanda mentioned as well, imagine being someone who is wondering, do I have a mental illness? Do I need help? How do I seek help? And then you hear this rhetoric that there's national registries. I'm not going to be allowed to hunt, own a firearm for recreational purposes, because I've been determined, based on a list, mental health care providers and healthcare providers would provide to the government to remove access for people with mental illness. Again, it's a chilling effect on help seeking. We do not need to move backwards when it comes to stigma around help seeking behavior. And I'll add to this an aspect of gender. Guys, we're worse at help seeking than women. And men own proportionately most of the firearms in this country. So who are we telling not to seek care? That actually puts us in greater general danger, not necessarily of gun violence, but of, I'm going to bring out suicide, right? That's an aspect of mental illness as well, and something that I think gets missed when we talk about mental illness and gun violence. So finally, Amanda said this as well. During my time at St. Ben's and St. John's, utilization of our counseling has doubled in that 20-year period. And that's a good thing. That means people feel more free to seek help and to access resources, hopefully get better, right, with the things that they need. And our top three presenting concerns are, as Amanda mentioned, they're the same in the general adult population. Anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and then a broad category that's not a diagnosis. It's just stress, right? And stress has many impacts on us in different ways. And none of those three shouldn't be at risk of losing their rights because they have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, mood disorder, like depression. And I could go on, but maybe I'll pause there and let Cardinal and Dr. Miller get involved.
Okay. All right. So I knew I had two professional psychologists up here today, so I was trying to lay off some of the statistics on mental health and everything. But one of the observations I wanted to begin with is that when we start associating gun violence with the mentally ill, one of the things that discourse does is it deflects attention away from a lot of other things. What do I mean by deflection? Well, one, as Mike just alluded to, we know that over half of the gun violence in this country is suicides, right? People killing themselves. And yet you frequently don't hear that presented in this frame of mental illness and gun violence, right? We reserve that discussion for mass shootings. I believe Amanda was quoting Ann Coulter earlier, who said guns don't kill people, the mentally ill do. After the El Paso shootings, President Trump said something similar, that hatred and mental illness are what pull the trigger, not the gun. But it's not just along party lines either, right? Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, once said that nobody wants the mentally ill to own a gun. So there's this widespread perception that when we talk about mental illness and gun violence, what we're talking about are mass shootings. And the definition of a mass shooting is a shooting that kills 4 or more people. But when we think about mass shootings, what we're typically imagining are like these large mass shootings, like the Tulsa nightclub, right, or El Paso. But we need to remember that there are over 200 mass shootings every year in this country on average, where somebody with a gun kills 4 or more people. And we typically are not paying attention to those. And the reason I mention that is most of those shootings of 4 people or 3 or 2 are domestic violence instances. So there's a heavily gendered component to most of the gun violence in this country. Half is suicide, and a large percentage of the rest is heavily gendered as domestic violence. And why do I say it's heavily gendered? Well, most of the fatal domestic violence incidents are men killing women. And when you read in the newspaper or you turn on the news and you hear somebody talk about murder-suicides, you should be critical about that language, right? Because murder-suicide is really a euphemism for a boyfriend or husband shooting a girlfriend or wife. That's what murder-suicides really are. And yet the way we talk about mental illness and gun violence deflects attention away from what is arguably accounting for most deaths in this country to gun violence. So one thing this conversation does is deflects attention from what the real problem is, right? A second thing it does is that the way we talk about gun violence and mental illness is it provides us a sense of certainty about something that's really hard to grasp otherwise, right? I was just telling my students today that I did my master's degree at Northern Illinois University, which back in 2008 on Valentine's Day had a horrific mass shooting. A gunman broke into the back of a lecture hall that was a lot like Pellegrin Auditorium. So he came in through the back door of the stage, fully loaded, and just opened fire on an auditorium of students sitting there in a lecture. And you can imagine how terrifying that would be trying to decide what to do, right? How do you leave? Do you lay down and play dead? Do you try to make a run for it? What happens? So I wasn't teaching there at the time, thank God, but I taught classes in that room. I could easily envision it. And it's hard to wrap your head around something like that, right? What has to happen for someone to commit that level of random, horrible, evil violence? And the fact of the matter is those are really intractable answers. There are no easy explanations for how something like that happens. But it really makes us, I think, feel a lot safer and sleep better at night if we can tell ourselves, oh, it's the mentally ill with guns. That's the problem. That's how this happens. So this conversation about gun violence and mental illness provides a degree of certainty, I think, that we are often eager for. The last thing I think it would do, and I'm really regretting not putting my readers on as I came up here, is that gun violence, it distorts the national conversation as well when we talk about mental illness and gun violence. The mentally ill are much, much more likely to be victims of violence than to be aggressors and the cause of violence. And that's just, again, it's borne out by the statistics. Somebody who suffers from mental illness is much more likely to be the victim of gun violence than actually be the perpetrator of gun violence. And yet, we lose track of that, right? As we talk about mass shootings and mental illness, we forget the fact that the mentally ill are a vulnerable population. They're the ones who are often victimized by gun violence. And so I think I'll just kind of stop there in talking about what I see as the three main ways that this conversation about gun violence and mental illness affects our national conversation.
Okay. So I'd like to say I'm probably going to be piggybacking off of a lot of what you said, and I brought some stats to reinforce what you've said too, and I'm sure my other two fellow colleagues have probably read these before. So there was a study in the APA journal on May 23rd, 2019 that talked about the Virginia Tech shooting a few years ago, the Pulse nightclub, and the Las Vegas one. And it talked about how media representatives just scrambled to name a motive, suggesting a probable association with mental illness. But in all those three cases, there wasn't a diagnosed mental illness, it was just suspected, and the people around the shooters just suspected that they had a mental illness, were really quick to peg it. And later they talk about how past research suggests mass shootings increase stigma associated with mental health, reinforcing the negative stereotype that people with mental illness are more dangerous and prone to violence than people without a mental illness. And I can directly contradict that with a study in 2001. It was in urban Los Angeles. They studied 83 individuals with various mental health issues, and the direct conclusion was that individuals in this sample were at least 14 times more likely to be victims of a violent crime than to be arrested for one. In general, the risk associated with being in the community was higher than the risk these individuals posed to the community. And that's a great point that needs to be stated, that they are vulnerable, a vulnerable population. I've worked in direct care homes with people with schizophrenia, traumatic brain injuries, dementia, and stuff like that. And they are really vulnerable adults. Anecdotally, I'd say that they're no more violent than the average individual. Lastly, I'd just like to touch on a point. If people are worried that people with mental illnesses maybe will want to take guns or something, I have a study, mental illness, previous suicidality, and access to guns in the United States. It states that participants with a lifetime psychiatric disorder and those with past suicidal thoughts, plans, and attempts were just as likely as those without to either carry a gun or store a gun in a potentially unsafe manner. So there's not really an increased likelihood if you do have a mental illness or lifetime psychiatric disorder to be more violent or to carry a gun. And just with these media reports, it really increases the stigma, which hurts everyone involved. And I am really open to ideas on how to solve this.
Are there any responses that any of the panelists have to any of the previous comments made by the other panelists? Well, I have a question, just going off what you finished with, Young. How do we change the conversation moving forward surrounding the rhetoric of mental illness following gun violence? What do we do moving forward?
Is that to the audience or us?
Also you, I'm
Oh. I'll start this time. Amanda said it's important to remember history, and she was using that in the context of the violence done to people with mental illness in this country. Another interesting insight history gives us is if you look back in the 1970s and the rhetoric that the NRA produced back then, you wouldn't even recognize it. You wouldn't even believe that it was coming from the National Rifle Association. Back then, the NRA was primarily interested in gun safety and responsible gun ownership. They took positions in favor of limiting gun access to people who had been accused of domestic violence. They approved gun laws that most people would label as reasonable today. And that conversation somewhere along the line changed very dramatically. I forget who it was mentioned national registries, right? The fact is that we've talked about creating national registries of the mentally ill. But that's a pretty significant redirection of what national registries were first used to discuss, which was of gun ownership, right? We have national registries for lots of things in this country, one of the most recognizable being automobiles, right? And we're licensed to carry those. And so there's certainly a lot of room to have a reasonable debate about what would a national registry on firearms look like, what ought it to do, is it a violation of constitutional rights or not? But to simply take it off the table and to instead flip it and start talking about, well, we ought to have national registries of people, which ought to make anyone familiar with history like really nervous. I mean, that never ends well. And so we need to reclaim the conversation in part. Like if we're going to talk about national registries, it should never be of people. It should be of the things that the people use, right? So that would be one thing I would throw out.
I have a question. Can you say a little bit more about what actually constitutes mental illness? It seems that people throw out that phrase frequently to describe people that perhaps have a personality different from what they're used to. So can you define mental illness a little more for our sake?
Can you repeat the questions when you get them, please?
So I won't be able to repeat the whole thing, but the premise of the question is, can you define mental illness for us so that we have a better sense of what we're talking about when it comes to this dialogue? I think perhaps Amanda and I both have thoughts. I'll start. Most of the time, I think when people are talking about what we call mental illness, they're talking about serious, persistent, chronic mental illness. So some of the diagnoses that fit into that are going to be schizophrenia, which has been mentioned. Some people with bipolar disorder would be considered in that category. And I don't want to go too far down that road. Some of the personality disorders would be another example. However, how we define it in psychology is that mental illness is the broad spectrum of the things listed in the DSM-5, right? And so someone with a mood disorder who has relatively mild mood symptoms would be classified as having a mental illness, but they're not who people think of when we are talking about gun violence and who to take guns away from, right? So it really does range from childhood disorders. Autism spectrum disorder is in the DSM-5, all the way up to diagnoses. I don't want to run through a list, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Maybe what would you add, Amanda?
I think the interesting thing when I was looking at some of this rhetoric is that the diagnosis you see kind of lobbied about the most often when you see these mass shootings is paranoid schizophrenia. That's the one people say, but the thing to know about that disorder is that often people who do struggle with that actually become sort of more restrained. They might kind of withdraw and close themselves off from others, and so maybe a much lower risk than people who do not have that disorder. So even when people are throwing this around, the depictions of people who are struggling with psychological difficulties do not match the reality of what we really would see clinically. What we're doing is constructing scary stereotypes to try to find some sort of a scapegoat.
I want to add on just a tiny little bit, and then yes, go to your question. The tiny little bit I would add is that the research being done shows us that there isn't a profile that fits that we could use to take the guns away from people, unnecessarily, what I might argue illegally. And so there's no profile that, even the idea, okay, it's a paranoid schizophrenic. Research doesn't bear that out, and so on. So I could go on, but we have two questions.
Just to carry on, to extend on that bit, so the question is, what is mental illness? And I would say a very succinct definition would be the inability to continuously advocate for your self-interest in a consistent manner. And on the flip side is, what is mental wellness? How would you describe mental wellness? And look at that, and then look at the opposite, the flip side of that, is mental illness. And also with that, mental illness is not either black or white or all or nothing. It's on a continuum.
Right.
So for depression, for example, there are 13 symptoms. You may need 7 or 8 of those symptoms to be officially diagnosed with major depressive disorder. But it doesn't mean that you have 5 or 6 that you're not mentally ill. Officially you are, but you have a decreased quality of life. So mental illness, I think, in a simple way of looking at it, is the inability to consistently self-advocate for your best interest and to have a subjective sense of your quality of life.
What's interesting about trying to define mental illness, and some of my abnormal psychology students who are in the room will know that that is a matter of ongoing debate in the field, and that has shifted over time. And we, particularly as a field, have not coalesced around a clear definition of psychologically normal compared to psychologically abnormal. But I want to go back to something, that initial question about what do we do about this? One, for those of you who are students, I do encourage you to take a psychology class, because then you really can start to learn fact from fiction a little bit. You can start to learn the nuance about what does and does not constitute mental illness. But I also just do want to put another plug in for Active Minds. What are things all of us can do? We really can talk about this. We can really talk about the ways in which all of us struggle from time to time. We can start to normalize mental illness, and we can start to hear people's stories and build empathy and start to break down some of these problematic stereotypes.
I was just going to say, Psych 111, folks, I expect to see a increase in enrollment for next semester. We're going to move into student questions and attendee questions for about the next 15 minutes. So feel free to raise your hand, I'll call on you, and then I'm going to repeat the question for our panelists, and so everybody in the audience can hear. Sure. So the question was, what makes mental health issues in America different from other countries in the world?
I would say I've read specifically on the amount of firearms that are available in the U.S., and they're basically ubiquitous. And I would say just with that, poses a lot greater risk for people with suicide ideation and maybe visions of doing a lot of violence. I would say just the fact that our gun laws are very loose. I don't know if we're allowed to go into that, but the fact that there are a lot out there, and I think it's like 30% of private-owned firearms in the world are U.S. owned. I would have to find the exact stat, but I would say the overwhelming amount of firearms in the U.S. makes it that much more pressing of an issue in our country.
I have another quote, actually, that kind of flips this a little bit. The current president of the American Psychological Association is Rosie Phillips Davis, who happened to be in Minnesota last fall at the Minnesota Psychological Association. So I had the chance to hear her speak. But on August 4th, she released a public statement about this rhetoric about guns and mental illness. I'll read to you part of what she said. She said, routinely blaming mass shootings on mental illness is unfounded and stigmatizing. Research has shown that only a very small percentage of violent acts are committed by people who are diagnosed with or in treatment for mental illness. She goes on to say, though, the rates of mental illness are roughly the same around the world, yet other countries are not experiencing these traumatic events as often as we face them. So she left that up for our interpretation. If mental illness is pretty consistent globally, what is happening here? What is unique about the United States, if perhaps it is not rates of mental illness?
Go ahead.
Thank you guys for all sharing. Very good insight. I keep leading back to the first question because I feel like we're not really answering it. Shane Miller, he talked about it a little bit, but what are ways that you think the media can start to frame then the conversation regarding the acts that are being committed? Because it's an issue, and so if once something's taken away, like, okay, we're going to start to move away from saying mental illness is the cause of this, what then do you guys think should be replaced with that? Because it's going to be replaced with something. So what should then be the conversation that we're having?
So the question was, how should the media be framing these events if they don't frame it within the context of mental health?
I so want to throw a colleague under the bus right now who teaches in media studies, and I know for a fact is familiar with framing theory and agenda setting, but I won't do that to her yet. So, I mean, it's a really tough question to ask, and what makes it so tough is that the news, what constitutes the news is, in a nutshell, what's sensational, like what grabs our attention. Suicides are sadly daily. Mass shootings are almost daily, right? 2 out of every 3 days, basically. They don't have that sensational oomph that gets them covered in the news, at least at a national level. So one thing I would say is that if we're talking about what the media need to do to reframe it, they need to do more large, comprehensive stories that are not looking at specific instances of gun violence, but gun violence writ whole. Start writing stories that inform people about suicides and guns. And Mike was saying earlier that men are much more likely to commit suicide. We also do it really, really well. Like out of suicide attempts, I don't remember the numbers, but men are terribly more effective at killing themselves than women because of guns, right? men will pick up guns, and they're not terribly forgiving if you shoot yourself with them, right? In a way that almost any other form of suicide is. So we need to have larger conversations about the topics rather than about the moments. And so I think Aaron, you have anything you want to add? Or?
That's what I would have said. Instead of framing it episodically, focusing on an episode, an instance of an individual that we can personalize, it should be brought more thematic as a policy or systemic sort of issue. You know, we're looking at causes, but not instances as illustration.
So, expanding on that, how can the media also, when they're reporting on the individuals who act out in violence, especially in mass shootings, how can we change? Because that's the first thing we do is we dig in and say, oh, he wrote this thing in his journal once, or there's, you know, like, because again, they're sensationalizing. So how can they frame that differently? How would you frame it?
Oh, I'd do so many things differently if I owned a newspaper. First of all, the media landscape is shifting so rapidly that it's almost impossible, at least in my mind, to talk about like what the media is going to look like in 5 years or 10 years. I had an advisee that graduated, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago now, and she did a year internship with The Onion and then immediately got a job after that with the Huffington Post. And the Huffington Post hired her for a section that had not existed when she graduated. I mean, she literally went into an area of the news that was not there 1 year prior when she had graduated. The role that podcasts and vlogs and, you know, God knows what will be around in a couple of years. In some ways, there's a really exciting democratic potential to allowing lots of other people to contribute. So I think one answer to your question is, you all need to start thinking of yourselves as a part of the media in a way that wasn't realistic even 5 years or 10 years ago, right? These things are, what, 12 years, 10 years old? Not even. Less than 10, I think, right? And think how drastically this has changed our ability to make our voices heard, right? So I think becoming informed, take Psych 111 and then take Com 103. And learn about the ways in which your voice can have an impact, right, and make a difference in the world and contribute to it. You don't have to be a star reporter for the New York Times or some big national press to get your voice out there and to have viewers, to have readers, and to make an impact.
I would just add that we should approach stereotypes about mental illness the same way we approach any other kind of stereotype, which is that we need to try to disrupt it again and again and again, whether it's in media or in everyday conversations.
In your professional opinions, what is the solution then to gun violence if mental illness tests and screenings are really counterproductive in the way of like buying a gun and like looking at their mental illness? Like, what's the solution then to gun violence and decreasing mass shootings if
I'm gonna say out loud what Amanda said. That is a little bit outside of my area. But part of what I would say as an answer, non-answer, is that it needs to be broad. It can't be narrow, focused. It's not just one topic, one way. It's not so. But I haven't studied public policy as it relates to gun violence, and so I can't give you the answer that maybe. And I wish I want the answer as much as you do. I guess is what I'm trying to get at. But certainly we may have opinions, but I'm not sure mine is very well informed.
Well, Sarah, if you want, though.
I will say, when Mike and I were talking about this last week, you know, if a side effect of this is a huge infusion of resources into helping increase mental health in the United States, that's a really, really great thing and really, really needed for a whole lot of reasons. Will it decrease mass shootings? That is an empirical question. I don't think so. But it would be a happy side effect, perhaps, of this discussion.
I'm not a policy expert, so I'm just going to say that. I don't even play one on TV, but I did research this quite a bit back in the day for my dissertation. And I will just throw out, I think we too often think we're really unique in this country. Like, our guns and our problems, you know, no one else has encountered these. And the reality is they have, and I think we don't have to look all that far for what other countries have done and have what works, and still recognize that there's differences in the cultures and the people and the traditions. But Australia, who shares a lot of similarities with us, had a terrible gun violent mass shooting incident, the Port Arthur massacre. And their response was to take the guns away from, you know, most of the guns away from the Australian population. And guess what? They've had 0 mass shootings in like the 15 years. So they're allowed hunting rifles, I believe, and that's about it. Our neighbors to the north, Canada, everyone points at like gun ownership's really high there and violence is really low, but try getting a handgun in Canada, right? So I think we need much more empirically informed discussions about what these policies are, and we don't get those a lot, right? There's a big difference in what you can do with a pistol versus what you can do with a long rifle, in terms of hurting somebody else and sort of hiding it, and in terms of shooting yourself. I mean, and we literally don't have those level of conversations, and it's really frustrating that everyone else on the planet seems to be able to figure this out except us. And Young was talking about, you know, the rates of gun ownerships in this country, and I just saw a statistic last week, and I meant to write it down. There's only 2 other countries that have higher rates of gun ownership than us, and I don't remember them, but they're both war-torn regions. I mean, like Yemen was one of them, I think, but it was just, our rates of gun ownership are literally on par with countries that have just been devastated by civil war for decades, and that's how many guns we have circulated in the country. So I'm not going to advocate particular policies, but I don't think this assumption that we can just trust everyone. I consider myself a responsible gun owner, but I don't think that's the viable option to go. It certainly hasn't been working. That's my opinion.
Let's go back there.
Take the guy up front.
So what is the impact of this rhetoric on mental health professionals and advocacy organizations?
I'm going to reread the question. The question was, what is the impact of this rhetoric on mental health professionals and advocacy organizations?
So for me, it kind of dovetails with what I said earlier. It concerns me for the future, for the welfare of people seeking help, right? And so it gives me some despondency, reduces my hope for what the future might look like for people who want to seek care, right? So, and the second part of your question is advocacy. It probably fits with that. If anything, it speaks to me that there's a need for more advocacy. So as someone who works in the field, it's grateful for the president of APA and the CEO of APA and other organizations to be more vocal and be more willing to cite research, scientific method, right, that has been used to dispel, but doesn't get the play that an opinion by a pundit or by a political leader gets. So.
We have a question.
Yeah.
Up in the rafters.
So psychologically, with the psychologists on the panel, are there any trends we've noticed in mass shootings of characteristics outside of the mental health debate? And if we are able to identify characteristics that aren't associated with mental illness, how can we begin addressing those appropriately and heal those things before they turn into these disasters?
Yeah, you know, I did a little bit of reading about this just yesterday, and I didn't bring all of my notes, so I will tell you what I remember, which is that it's a lot more complicated than certainly it seems in media reports. There are some things that are sometimes common, things like domestic violence is often very common, gender issues are very common. But one of the interesting things, this came from a blog that was featured on the APA website, where someone who was a forensic psychologist who's really been looking into the characteristics of mass shooters in the United States suggested that most of them had this pattern of being in some sort of an intense kind of experience, intense emotions for whatever reason, that would not qualify as a diagnosis of mental illness, but they were experiencing some kind of crisis often, which is again something that does not constitute mental illness, but perhaps can give us some hints that, and really their suggestion was that psychologists should be thought of maybe as like first responders. Could psychologists be mobilized when people are experiencing some sort of intensity or emotional crisis to assist? And so that call was for more kind of community engagement and community psychology. But that's just one person in a blog on the APA website. So there, that's what I have.
Well, just to follow up on that note, in the Star Tribune this week, there's been a number of articles on mental health in the business section, which I was surprised to read about that. But two initiatives out of the Twin Cities. One is People Incorporated, I think is the organization. They're celebrating their 50th year. And the new chief executive officer is a nurse who was the director of inpatient mental health at Regents Hospital. And the whole premise is to be proactive and establish mental health centers in the community, to intervene early, to do a whole cultural impact of addressing homelessness or isolation and giving people some place to live and those sorts of things. And the other initiative was the University of St. Thomas is starting a new school. It's called the School of Health, and the new director of that program is somebody who is the chief operating officer at the Wilder Foundation in St. Paul. And again, it's sort of that same premise of intervening in the community proactively to address some of these cultural phenomena, such as isolation or alienation or lack of a job or homelessness. And those trying to intervene by elevating the quality of life, which in theory would then reduce the propensity to want to go out and commit some mass shooting or something.
Yeah. So just to repeat that for everyone, it sounds like there are local initiatives that are really community-based. And so that would be Steve Stelzner's community psychology class, for all of you who are following along. There is a long history of this, so if there really were a big infusion of resources into psychology, that is what I would expect to see a big infusion in community-based kinds of preventative work and advocacy and intervention, because we know that when we go to where people are at, we are more effective. And we're more effective in prevention than necessarily mitigation.
Go ahead.
There was recently a law introduced to Congress where if people go into therapy appointments and they would say something about maybe premeditated ideas of hurting other people, psychiatrists would come report them to the government, and the government would come take away their guns or any weapons or obstruction. Do you, as psychiatrists, do you guys think that that would be a useful law? Would that be helpful, or would that just kind of change and make you less trustworthy?
Basically, to repeat the question a little bit, right? I'm not familiar with the legislation you're talking about, but basically legislation was introduced, maybe you are?
I think it's called the red flag laws.
Okay. So here's what I would say about that as a psychologist, and I want to differentiate just for the sake of us. A medical doctor who prescribes medication for mental health issues is a psychiatrist, and a person with a doctorate or a master's in counseling or psychology is a counselor or psychologist. So as a psychologist, what I would say is there are avenues currently that a therapist can use if they believe that there's an imminent risk of harm to the client or an identified person, right? And if you're wanting to look things up, for most states it's the Tarasoff finding. I'm not going to go into the story of that particular case, but that was kind of a watershed moment where therapists prior to that weren't notifying potential victims of violent crime, and a woman died, right? So we can and have the avenues we need to not remove firearms, but to get that person the care that they need and to notify the potential victims of the threat, right? So on some level, I would support the idea that if someone, let's use Shane's example, a person with a history of domestic violence is in treatment, they're saying that if this goes this way, and I'm not going to get into the story, right? If this goes this way, I'm going to kill my partner. I have what I need to notify the partner and law enforcement that threat has been made. It's law enforcement's duty to decide what happens with that person, firearms, and so on. Now, is that part of the problem is it's not universal. Every state has their own way of interpreting the Tarasoff case, and how that gets played out in different states, in different counties, in different cities is part of the challenge with that. So that's at least a partial answer, but generally speaking, yes, if we can identify that someone is going to harm themselves or someone else, we need to act, and we need to have the mechanisms to make that happen.
We literally have the duty to warn.
Right. Does that cover the? Okay.
Since it's getting pretty close to 8, I'm going to allow all of the panelists to give just a quick sentence or two as a wrap-up. Your thoughts?
All right, I'll go ahead. So I'm going to tag into what Amanda said. Like many of these things, we can talk about different angles, different individual, societal. Honestly, I think it comes down to engagement and connection. That as human beings, we have to figure out how to do some of the things we're doing different. Yes, we need to do all the other things that public policy people are exploring and inventing, but day by day, we need to connect on a human level compassionately with each other. To me, that's the key.
I think my message is mostly to students, but to anyone in this room, if you are struggling, we're here for you. People are here to help, so please seek out help while you can.
I'll say the increased stigma with a lot of these media reports definitely hurts those with mental health, and it might discourage them from going to seek help. But as someone who has personally sought help and gone into use clinical and counseling services here at St. John's, St. Ben's, it's been a tremendous benefit. And yeah, I would say for anybody that is even considering it, I would definitely do it. And I just want to say thank you again to the Active Minds faculty members that came here and were on the panel with me, Dr. Ewing and Dr. Jantzer.
I guess I would conclude by just saying, first of all, take the opportunity, if you care about the issue, to make yourselves informed about it. There's a lot of facts out there, a lot being written about it, so read up, follow the links, look for the good data, don't be satisfied with sound bites, be informed. The other thing I'd say is literally make your voices heard, even if that's as simple as calling a representative. Your lawmakers do listen to you. I know that sounds silly and naive, and it's not the message you get about they don't care, but they do, and they listen, and they rely on your votes. And if they start to realize you are not pleased with the positions they're staking out, if they're recognizing that you, their constituents, have strong views that lean one way rather than another, they will listen. Maybe not immediately, but this is long-term social change we're talking about. So be informed, make your voices heard.
Let's give our panelists a well-deserved round of applause. Before we finish up tonight, one of the key tenets of the McCarthy Center is civic engagement. Today happens to be National Voter Registration Day. I'm going to have one of the student coordinators, Joe, give you a little introduction about what National Voter Registration Day is all about.
As Quinlan said, I'm Joe Bastian. I'm the student civic engagement coordinator for the McCarthy Center. So, as he said, today is National Voter Registration Day. And so although there aren't a lot of big midterm or presidential elections this year, there are still a lot of elections happening, a lot of special elections happening at a local level. So there are 70 school district elections, 9 city council, and 4 county board elections happening this November. These elections impact the priorities of local communities and therefore impact you, a citizen, much more than any presidential election could. So our vision for today is to springboard into a larger campaign for voter education. The time to educate about voting is now, and we can positively impact voter turnout for the primaries and the 2020 election through our efforts this year. This is a call to action. Our demographic and our age group are statistically the lowest of any age group by a considerable margin. And you guys probably know that because you guys are the ones that are here, but we need to educate the people that aren't here right now. So our goals this year center around reaching out to people to educate them on voter suppression, how to register to vote, where you vote, and the importance of registering to vote. And the priority groups that we're looking to reach out to are the minority groups around the communities close to St. John's and St. Ben's and St. John's students, area high school students, and citizens of the surrounding cities. So if you're passionate about being civically engaged and your voice being heard, as Senator Eugene McCarthy said, there's only one thing to do: take it to your country.
All right, before we wrap up, I just want to make one last announcement. First of all, I'm Delaney Sutton. I'm one of the co-presidents for Active Minds. And I just wanted to let everyone know that coming up after break, October 10th, is World Mental Health Day. And we are going to be collaborating with both Senates on both the campuses, Health Initiative, Health Advocates, and a few other clubs here on both campuses for a World Mental Health Awareness Week. Sorry, October 7th through the 11th. So keep an eye out for announcements on that, and reach out to any of us if you're interested in joining or just being a part of that week. And also keep an eye out for any other Active Minds events coming up. We'd love to see you guys there. So once again, thank you to the panelists for creating the conversation and insight, and thank you all for coming.
I just have to give one more quick plug for a few McCarthy Center events that are coming up. So on Monday, October 7th, we have an event on school improvement in rural South Africa. As you may know, St. Ben St. John's has a very strong relationship study abroad in South Africa, so that's going to be a very exciting event. And then finally, on Thursday, October 17th, we're going to have an event featuring the former mayor of Falcon Heights, Minnesota, and one of the best friends of Philando Castile on community transformation after the killing of Philando Castile, which happened 3 years ago. So those are both going to be fantastic events, and I hope to see you all there. So thanks for coming tonight. Have a good night.